And this morning we continue our series in the Old Testament book of Esther. Esther tells the dramatic story of the Jewish people living in the Persian Empire and now under threat of extermination through the actions, people will talk about, but they are saved by the courageous actions of individuals, and particularly Queen Esther. And their enemies will be defeated. And the story is very action-packed, it's full of twists and turns, and in some ways it's not unlike a soap opera. Try, yes. Full of twists and turns. So here's, I guess, some three American soap operas that are quite prominent somewhere. I can't say that I've really seen them. I believe I've seen 15 minutes of The Bold and the Beautiful and needed an ambulance. As you might imagine, I'm not really a great soap opera fan. But soap operas are a particular kind of television show, although they originally came from radio shows. In fact, they got their name from radio shows that were sponsored by soap companies. So they became soap operas. And so they're typically a serial program, and they go for ever, often. So for example, Coronation Street probably has run longer than Western civilization. At least it feels that way. They have ensemble or large and varied casts. So they have lots of different characters in them, and they're very dramatic, and they're melodramatic, and they're complicated. Everything's just such a drama in a soap. And if you want to know what's going to happen next in any given situation in a soap opera, this is how you know. Just think, what will make it more complicated? And that's what's going to happen. And so I thought for the purposes of this message, I would confess to you my favourite soap opera. I won't ask you what your allegiance might be, but my favourite soap opera is this. So back when I was much younger, before I knew the Lord, mostly, I watched Dallas, and Dallas was a 1970s, early 1980s show. How many people remember Dallas, the show? We're all so old, thank you. As you can imagine, it was set in Dallas, Texas, and around the Ewing family, who were self-made oil millionaires, or billionaires in today's inflation-adjusted terms. And the dominant character and arch-villain was the man in the centre, J.R. Ewing, known as short for John Ross, but always referred to as J.R. And J.R. was a double-crossing, backstabbing, dishonest, unfaithful snake in the grass. And he was good at it. And he was hated, and he was a tremendous character. And at the end of one season, J.R. was shot. And this is where, if you ever wondered where TV series get their season-ending cliffhanger, comes from Dallas. Dallas popularised it. So J.R. got shot at the end of an episode where he systematically ruined the lives of 7 other characters in great detail. It's a really impressive episode. I've never seen anyone be so nasty in 45 minutes. It was just amazing. And he was shot at the end of the episode, and then everyone asked afterwards, who shot J.R.? It became a cultural phenomenon. In between the 2 seasons, there was a presidential election. And the Republicans put out campaign buttons that said the Democrats shot J.R. There was a national betting pool which had 14 major suspects, and I'll just list a few prominent ones. His wife, who was tired of his infidelities and was struggling with her own alcoholism. His wife's former lover. His sister-in-law, who he had an affair with. His brother, who was a business rival. His niece, whose engagement he broke up at the end of the previous season. His father, who was exasperated by his dirty tricks, assorted others who'd been defrauded, cheated, double-crossed, backstabbed and ruined, and even J.R. himself, who was believed to have staged it. It's such a huge phenomenon. When the main actor, a guy called Larry Hagman, went on holiday to the UK, he was asked by no less a person than the Queen Mother who shot J.R. He said, I couldn't possibly tell you, Your Majesty. But the thing is, he didn't know, because they'd filmed everyone shooting him, including himself. Caesar, the mystery was not revealed until episode 4 of the next season. And that, at the time, had a record viewership of all time, of 83 million viewers. Of course, this is back in the days, there is no streaming. It's live broadcast, so everyone was watching Who Shot JR? And JR did recover, went through rehab to be thoroughly evil for the next 2 seasons till someone finally shot him dead after in the next couple of seasons. Now, I reminded that in the first service, I didn't tell people who shot JR. It was the sister-in-law. So I didn't pick it at the time. I thought, man, everyone hates that guy. Could even be his mum. So let's move on to the subject of the day. Esther, episode 6, the wicked falter. I think it's important when we talk about this message today. The book of Esther wasn't originally written for entertainment purposes, and it relates to facts and stories that are true. And it's a story of how God intervenes, even though God is not mentioned by name, is one of the features of this book. And his activity to save his people. But nevertheless, before we read, we're going to look at chapter 6 and from verse 1. But before we read that, let's just recap episode 5. In episode 5, last week, Queen Esther is now the primary wife of the king of Persia. An evil nobleman, rich and powerful, named Haman, is an ancestral enemy of the Jews, and a particular enemy of her cousin Mordecai, who has adopted her when her parents died, and wanted to exterminate the Jews and kill Mordecai. In fact, he has made plans over dinner to get him wiped out imminently, and so Mordecai is a dead man walking. And that's where we come to as the story opens tonight. This morning. Episode 6, the wicked falter. So reading from verse 1. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honour and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, the attendants answered. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him in episode 5. We'll just skip down a couple of verses there. Bring him in, the king ordered. Verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honour? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would honour apart from me? Or rather honour than me. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the noble robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honour. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you've suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He rode Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honour. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh's wife and all his friends everything that had happened before him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom our downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, and you cannot stand against him, you will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs came to take him out for dinner. Now, another piece of the backstory in the previous episode, Queen Esther, but tired actually after first service, Queen Esther has made her move and to try and influence the king, and she started a 2-part dinner party with Haman and the king to request his help. And that happened in the previous chapter, and at the end of this story, he's taken up to the next one. and Queen Esther has risked her life to do that. This chapter has an amazing three-step reversal of fortune between Haman and Mordecai. At the end of chapter 5, Haman is the most powerful man in the kingdom apart from the king, effectively second in command of the kingdom. He is riding high. Mordecai is an official in the palace somewhere whom Haman hates, and he's basically a dead man because over dinner they've made plans to have him killed. And in fact, Haman has built some sort of scaffold. There's translational discussions, or just a pole to impale him upon later. So things are looking bad. But by the end of it, it's Mordecai who's exalted. Haman's career is tottering and seemingly in ruins. And it all happens in the various steps. It just happens that the king can't sleep. And so, because he doesn't have Siri, he says, "Servant, bring me the record of my reign." And we don't know why he does that. Maybe he does that when he's bored, or it's a great cure for insomnia. I imagine if you were reading the chronicles of your reign, it would be tremendous if you couldn't sleep. You say, "Oh, the 7th year and the 9th month, the prophets were, and the dividend." But no. And then it just happens that Mordecai is saving the king from assassination, as mentioned. Oh. And then the king asks, "Well, what happened?" And well, no one's given a rule. I better do something about that. And so he thinks, who's in the court that I can seek advice from? Who's coming in the court? And it just happens that Haman is coming into the court, thinking he's going to ask the king to have Mordecai killed. It just happens the king asks Haman about, what should I reward a man I want to reward? And Haman thinks, obviously it's me, and gives him his fondest wish. And it just happens that Haman has to carry out that reward for Mordecai. And this is one of the big things in the story of the book of Esther, where a whole lot of things just happen. And when you have a lot of just happens, after a while you begin to think, actually, there's something behind this, someone behind this that is moving this. And this is what makes the book of Esther special. It just happened that Esther was selected as the potential bride. It just happened that she was chosen by the king. It just happened that Mordecai was in place to stop an assassination. It just happened. This reward, I'll just have a pause, tension's building. While I have a drink, thank you. It just happened, this reward that Mordecai receives is both personally and politically devastating for Haman. Personally, because this is the reward that he wanted. He is an egotistical, insecure, dominating, vicious character who always wants to be number one. So when he's asked what he can get, he asks for something that he figures he would not share with anyone else, let alone some Jewish scum like Mordecai, who he wants to have dead. So that personal loss is real. Also, to wear the king's robe, to ride the king's horse with the king's symbol, is to associate yourself with the king. It makes you the king's most favourite person. To have that robe placed upon you by a prince of the realm is to make yourself a supreme noble, because normally it's servants who dress their betters. So if a noble person is dressing you, then they're basically your servant. So you're the supreme noble. And Haman has to be Mordecai's servant. To then take him out publicly and announce this is actually an incredible political disaster. The capital city is full of powerful, politically attuned nobles and bureaucrats, and they have spent their lives trying to anticipate the wishes and the whims of the king. They are highly sensitive to any power shifts. Everyone knows Haman has plotted the destruction of the Jews. I'm sure it's very widespread that he hates Mordecai. What has happened? Here he is, the king's previous number 2 man, top dog, is now a servant to Mordecai the Jew. Has Haman fallen out of favour? Are we going to see a change in policy? And all the political minds in the city turn towards us. So Haman's enemies are emboldened. His friends and allies are disheartened. The king actually hasn't turned against Haman yet. It's coming up next time. But people sense the political winds are shifting. And they feel the ground's coming up from underneath Haman. And Haman knows it too. And so that's why he's personally grieved and goes home in shame. And he hasn't really recovered when the king's servants come and sweep him up to part 2 of the banquet. 3 lessons here. Oops. Strength without goodness is vicious. This is actually a big theme in the book of Esther. Xerxes and Haman are strong and powerful people, but they're not necessarily good people. And when you have power without goodness, well, you'll just crush anyone who gets in your way. I mean, Xerxes, he didn't really seem to be too troubled about killing the Jewish people. He was probably a bit drunk and wasn't paying attention, but even that says something. Haman is willing to kill a whole lot of people for the sake of his ego. When we think about the kings and queens of ancient times, we don't really understand them properly, because when we think about royalty, we think of this. There we are, Queen Elizabeth and Charles, Queen Elizabeth II and Charles III. And so what are these? These are constitutionally limited monarchs. They have lifetimes dedicated to public service. Queen Elizabeth, was there all my life as an example of goodness. And then now her son has taken over, not quite the same substance as his mother, but he means well. He'll do his best. We look to them as actually, they're giving it a good go, and they're probably helpful and largely ceremonial and being paid for by the British mainly, so that's tremendous. So, but that's not what these ancient kings are like. If you want to know what the ancient kings are like, they're more like these people. Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, Kim Jong-un. So North Korea is like a communist personality cult. And effectively, people are taught to worship him, but they wouldn't because they're atheists, but they more or less do. And people live literally in fear of upsetting him. I read an article on it, and someone wrote in a magazine, and I'll just quote this one little statement. It says, to put it mildly, just about everyone in North Korea who isn't named Kim Jong-un lives in perpetual mortal terror of dissatisfying, irking, or appearing disloyal to him. So, for example, his uncle was perceived to be disloyal, it's believed. So he had his uncle executed. And not just his uncle, but his uncle's entire family, including his children and grandchildren. And in North Korea, if you disobey the government, they don't just punish you, they take your whole extended family into a camp. And he has been known to have his political opponents overseas die. People who have fled North Korea. And Vladimir Putin, of course, the president of Russia, best known for invading countries that aren't his and bombing civilian populations. But also, he's a tremendous person at winning every election with tremendous majorities and imprisoning his political opponents, some of whom die of surprising natural causes in prison. And even ones that have fled the country have been known to die of strange freak poisonings and air crashes. And so these are more like the ancient monarchs. The trappings are different in the modern age. But these are the people with the same kind of authority that we're talking about. So think of Xerxes, Haman, these are the guys. Second thing, God brings down the wicked. God brings down the wicked. Haman's fall is already underway. This is a big theme of the Old Testament. God opposes the wicked and the evil. Really, when I was doing this message, I thought I had chapter 7 as well, and I was tremendously excited because there's blood and violence and impalement. And I didn't get that, so I'm a bit gutted. But it's a bit like, you're at home with your loved one and you have a movie night and you're trying to choose one for each of you, and she wants a rom-com that's warm and fuzzy, and you're just thinking what we really need is the moral clarity of an action film with hand-to-hand combat, automatic weapons, and large quantities of high explosives, And if I'd had chapter 7, it would have been a perfect Father's Day men's message, you know. But nonetheless, the principle still holds true. God brings down the wicked. The book of Esther, one of the reasons it's probably so popular and so strong is that it does echo the teaching of the Old Testament. So I'm going to read Psalm 64. And just don't think about it too deeply, but as I read it, just think about the events of the story and just see how these are echoed. Hear me, my God, as I voice my complaint. Protect my life from the threat of the enemy. Hide me from the conspiracy of the wicked, from the plots of evildoers. They sharpen their tongues like swords and aim cruel words like deadly arrows. They shoot from ambush at the innocent. They shoot suddenly without fear. They encourage each other in evil plans. They talk about hiding their snares. They say, who will see it? They plot injustice and say, we have devised a perfect plan. Surely the human mind and heart are cunning. But God will shoot them with his arrows. They will suddenly be struck down. He will turn their own tongues against them and bring them to ruin. All who see them will shake their heads in scorn. All people will fear. They will proclaim the works of God and ponder what he has done. The righteous will rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. All the upright in heart will glory in him. And this actually is kind of like a pattern that follows in Esther. The evildoers plot. But the Lord knows. And suddenly he strikes. And they are brought low by their own words. Well, at least they will be in episode 7 and 8, which gets played out in the list. But we're in process here. And then the last key point today. God uses his people to beat the odds. God is active, but he usually works through people. Mordecai and Esther are the main people he works through in this story, I guess. But in many ways, they were just ordinary people trying to make the best of the situations they found themselves in. Mordecai worked in the king's palace, probably trying to make a living and do well for himself and his family. Esther was a Jewish orphan, adopted by Mordecai. Probably the biggest aspiration she had would have been a good marriage and a family of her own. But that didn't happen for either of them. I'm sure Mordecai didn't see himself locked into a death power struggle with the second most powerful person in the kingdom, or the most powerful person after the king. I'm sure Esther didn't see herself being conscripted into a national beauty contest and joining the king's harem and then becoming the king's number one wife. None of them expected this, but this was the circumstances they found themselves in. And they had to trust the Lord in the circumstances they were in. But that's always been the way for the Lord's people. It's always been that way. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, you have all this long chapter on people who had faith and lived by faith, and I'll just show a piece of it here. And you see down there in the yellow, different characters: Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. And these are heroes of the faith. Through who faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. So that's all tremendously triumphant. Then you go back further. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and chains and imprisonment. So when you think about these heroes of the faith, even the list that were there, they're a pretty scraggly bunch, really. None of them thought of themselves or planned to be heroes. They are a list of the timid, the impetuous, the irreverent, and even the insignificant. And yet, they became heroes. None of them were or imagined to themselves to become, what they would be, imagined that they would do what they did and became. So the question I want to finish with for you is this. Oh, I did blow my nose, actually, because it's a pretty tight moment. Excuse me, one moment. Just keep you in suspense. Sorry. Thank you. Right, back to the key question. The question, if in some circumstance, in a difficult circumstance, you become God's person, will you say yes? We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what difficulties or circumstances we may face. And it may be that you are God's person on the spot. And yes, you might be thinking, oh, there's tremendous people back in church. They could do this, and it would be amazing. But he's not there. And God might say to you, well, they're not there. You're my person on the spot. So I'll use you. That was the case of these great heroes of the faith. God had chosen them, whether they wanted it or not necessarily in some cases. And that may be so with you. It may be so with you now. Are you facing circumstances now where you must be God's person in a difficult situation? It could be personal, or it could be a larger, bigger issue. It could be a very visible thing, or it could be an invisible thing that only a few people know about. But is that you? And will you say yes to God's calling now and in the future sometime? When the chips are down somewhere, in some way, and the rest of us are at home and you're there, you're the person on the spot, will you say yes? When I was raising our kids, one of the things I used to say to them is saying, one day you're going to grow up and you're going to have to decide, is this faith really yours, or is it just a family thing? Because one day you're going to be the only one in the room who's for the Lord. And what are you going to do with it? And so I'm going to say to you, one day you're going to be the only one in the room. And are you going to say yes to God's call? Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we're overwhelmed by your greatness. You're not afraid of the strength of people, however powerful they might be. You work to oppose evil. You use your people to do it, to bring goodness and to be a witness and agent for you in this world. And Lord, that's us. So Lord, who among us are you calling to now? Bring to our mind the place where we need to stand for you, where we need to say yes. And in the future, Lord, equip us and enable us and give us a sight of you so that we will say yes when the time comes.